And welcome everyone to this edition of the Charleston Leadership Interviews. My name is Meg White. We are so happy that you could spend time with us today, and we're so happy that our panel could spend time with us today. I am fortunate enough to be joined by Gwen Evans, who is Vice President, Global Library Relations at Elsevier, Robin Price, Bibliometrics and Indicators Manager at Imperial College London, and Beth Blanton-Kent, who is Director of Collections at the University of Virginia Library. So panel, welcome. We are just thrilled to have you here today to share some of your wisdom and insight on a very interesting topic. You are all industry veterans, and you're a group that's convening at Charleston to focus your knowledge and expertise on the topic of data-driven diversity, equity, and inclusion in library collections. This is a fantastic group. We're so pleased to be able to get to know each of you a little bit more today and hear a little bit about how this panel came to be. So with that said, this group collaborated on this plenary at Charleston this year, focused on data-driven DEI. I'd like to start, maybe tell our group a little bit about the context for this panel. How did it come about? DEI, so top of mind for us in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives. This group is challenging librarians and our audience to take a little bit of a different approach, a more quantitative approach to faculty and student demand for diverse curricula and collections. So how did this panel come about? Why is this topic and approach important, and why now? And I think we're going to throw it over to start with Gwen.
So I had seen an internal presentation by my colleague Holly Falk-Krasinski, who is the Vice President of Research Relations and Global Strategic Networks. And it was about Elsevier's data-driven efforts to analyze gender equity in the research ecosystem. And it had a lot to do with metadata. And I said to her, metadata and librarians' interest in DEI, what could be better? Why don't we start presenting to librarian audiences? So we did a CNI presentation and we did an ACRL presentation, which were very well received. And then I happened to see both Robin and a colleague of Beth's present in different venues using data-driven approaches. Robin, I saw her presentation at UKSG, and another Robin Rugaber at University of Virginia. And both of them were trying to use data to advance diversity and inclusion efforts. So when Heather Staines at Delta Think reached out to me about a possible Charleston panel, I immediately thought of those two, reached out, and happily they said yes.
So that is very serendipitous for sure. And Heather certainly instrumental in promoting, this kind of perspective. But Beth and Robin, for you all, Gwen mentioned that you have some local initiatives. Can you talk about how this became a priority for you and about those initiatives at each of your institutions? I don't know if Robin, you want to lead that off.
Thank you. Yes, so as Gwen described, a project at my institution, Imperial College London, was really seeking to understand whether the reading lists or the curricula set by course instructors and often passed from course instructor to course instructor sort of seek to understand the distribution of authors and perhaps any characteristics of those authors that are cited in the reading lists, and where perhaps there might have been before not data available on this to course instructors. We then felt that if there were data available, that this would help course instructors and faculties, if they were inclined to do so, to be able to use data as evidence in any decision making, and also for any work that they might be doing, and that we are trying to help them to do, to understand inequalities or missing regions or missing characteristics of authors, to be sort of justified and held accountable by having data available as evidence.
So here at the University of Virginia, like many libraries, we're very good at collecting data. And the university is very good at collecting data, but we're not always good at putting that data together to tell a complete story. Often in library world, we use cost per use or circulation data to describe the value that the library brings to the scholarly endeavors of our researchers, faculty, and students here. But we wanted to take a deeper dive into that data, put it together, and see if we could analyze it in a way that would better inform our collection practices, our teaching and learning initiatives, and our service delivery. And that was the primary drivers for us in terms of developing this tool. It is and still something that we're working on, because we recognize it looks at a portion of the data that we can get to, but it is important for us to be able to identify our users beyond the stories that filter back to us, beyond just the data, and to put it together in some meaningful ways that really improve the environment here at the university.
So, well, first of all, it's so interesting, Gwen, you talked about how this stemmed from an internal presentation at Elsevier, because I can remember, I believe it was 2019, when Kumsal gave the keynote address, the president of Elsevier, CEO of Elsevier, I'm going to mess up her title, gave the keynote at Charleston. And one of the things she mentioned was an increased focus within Elsevier on diversity, equity, inclusion, and the voices with whom they worked in terms of authorship. And, you know, as a woman, I think she spoke very uniquely to, you know, women scientists, specifically in STEM fields, being traditionally underrepresented. So it's fascinating that that sort of came from internal conversations at Elsevier, and you can see her leadership kind of trickling through the organization. But Robin and Beth, I love the fact that Robin spoke specifically about faculty and curricula and course materials. And Beth, you talked about that too, but you also talked about, you know, the researchers and their approach. So really interesting, and looking forward to this. So Professor Maya Angelou once said, you know, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. So I think, you know, data is a key way to help us do better. What do you think are the key roles for librarians in helping scholarship do better when it comes to DEI? I don't know who wants to jump in on that first. Beth, do you want to take that one?
I will. Thank you, Meg. One thing that I think is important for librarians is not to lose their voice in the conversation, to be partners with the faculty, to be good stewards of our budgets, to talk about what we collect, why we collect, and how we would like to see it integrated in the classrooms. In terms of library writ large, I think it's important for us to always have an eye out on our policies, to be willing to collaborate both across libraries and within our institutions, to ensure our spaces are safe spaces and welcoming for all, and to make sure that our collections represent the wealth of knowledge that's out there and the possibilities for research and extending knowledge. We have just recently hired an associate dean for IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. And I think that's an important step for academic libraries to make, both to collaborate on efforts nationally and internationally, and also to collaborate with our partners at our home institutions.
And Gwen or Robin, anything to add there?
Absolutely, in agreement with Beth and some of the points that she raised. I think particularly the contribution and responsibility that the library sector has to research institutions for many of the things that we do that is leading or contributing to the way that people have access to read research, people have access or resources to publish research, and in many cases how the reward system and the way that research is valued is something that the library sector has for a long time now and will continue to have an increase in the importance of the way that we contribute to those discussions. And I think and particularly the role that libraries have in representing their organizations as we, particularly that kind of access to research and open access, go through negotiations to transition many research publishing models to more equitable open access models. That I think is a really important way that we can support academia to become more equitable and open.
And I would just say that as a publisher on the scale that Elsevier publishes, there's what Beth mentioned, collections. Well, the platform in a lot of ways is now the library. And that is true from the moment of submission to the end user. And so what does the publishing industry, how does the publishing industry use data to improve precisely those issues and concerns that are also in the library on the ground? So you mentioned the commitment that CUMSAL showed to internal as well as external initiatives. And one of the last years I've been lucky to work with Simon Holt, who is the Disability Confidence Manager on the journal side of the house. And he is working to ensure that there's equitable access to the platform from the moment of submission. So do researchers and authors with disabilities, do they have as equitable, or supported access to the publishing system, the peer review system, the editorial system? So that's all part of, at scale, what publishers are trying to do. And to go back to the data-driven part of it, how do we use data to inform actionable insights that you can use? So for example, one of the things that Elsevier started with was what is the gender breakdown of, for example, peer reviewers and the editorial staff. And on the journal sites now, for I think 800 titles at this point, you can see what is the gender composition of the editorial staff, which might help someone when they're looking at deciding whether they're going to submit there or whether they're going to be a peer reviewer. So going back to that sort of, you have the data, now what? It's not just data, but what actions are you trying to support or review or improve?
Well, and that's so interesting. And that's like, once you know better, you have to know better before you can do better, right? But it's so interesting that you're using those metrics internally as a check, but then also exposing them to the community so that they can better understand, the characteristics of the various publications across. So it's an internal view, but then also that transparency out into the market. That's fascinating. So
I'll just mention one of the most interesting things when Holly and I started presenting to this, to librarians, was sort of the questions we were getting, like, well, this is fascinating, this is so useful. How, are you going to expose those on Scopus profiles, for example? And Holly and I were like, oh no. This has to be aggregate anonymous data.
oh,
for a lot of reasons. But to me, it's interesting, that balance between, trying to use this data in very specific ways, but the tension between rolling that data back and saying, no, really, this is not an appropriate use of data. Or there are huge risks in tying it to an individual as opposed to at the aggregate level.
Well,
Oh,
and
absolutely, Gwen. I see the parallels quite strongly with the responsible metrics progress that's something obviously that librarians have been strongly a part of and contributing to how we understand that what is a meaningful metric and what is a the data shouldn't be shared for this data's sake. It's not an end in itself. It's how do we, as like you described, use this data to benefit decision making and to hold those decision makers accountable.
so I was just going to say, that's always sort of the what I would say, the sticky wicket of all of this is ensuring that the ethics come along with the practice, like so many other things in technology side. This doesn't exist outside of that. So I'm fascinated. I can't wait to hear your talk. We are taping this prior to Charleston, so it's coming up next week, but I will be in the audience. But you each work in relatively diverse settings and roles within the scholarly ecosystem. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about each of your backgrounds and how you kind of got here. I'm not sure who wants to dive in first. All librarians, I should say. But probably by training and still by DNA, but diverse organizations, diverse roles. So how'd you get here? The audience would like to know a little bit about you specifically.
So I actually don't have librarian training or a librarian background. I originally worked at a journals publisher in editorial work on open access and subscription journals. And then moved to the research institution that I work at the moment, sort of taking some of that knowledge from the journal publication process. And then there at the institution within the library, I've set up a bibliometrics with a strong responsible metrics commitment and focus for the institution.
That's amazing in and of itself, because that's a whole new role in the landscape that maybe even a decade ago we couldn't have imagined. So really interesting, Robin. How about you, Beth?
Well, I started life as a chemistry and physics librarian, which was quite exciting. Enjoyed that for several years, and then discovered that the collections, the materials, connecting people with specific materials was my forte and my interest. And then so I gradually moved over into a collections role. From the perspective of DEI, I and my team have been interested in broadening our collections here and actively going out and interacting with our student and faculty user communities to discuss specific sections of our collections to say, how are we doing here? Are you using this? What would be better for us to provide? Do you have this in the media in which it can be most used and in the classroom or for your research? And from there, that interest has just continued to grow. We, of course, will always work with the canonical publishers, but we are looking for diverse voices out there, diverse providers of data, information, streaming media, everything that we can do to broaden and enrich the experience of our students and researchers here.
So on just a follow-on question to that, on the quantitative side, when you did start to take a look maybe at some of the more numbers-driven aspects of the collection, did you have any moments where you went, holy cow, I never realized, like, that's the craziest artifact I've ever seen, and we had no idea that was like bubbling along?
To some extent, yes. For instance, as we wanted to look at our Middle Eastern collections, we had an idea of who our constituency was, and we're totally surprised by where most of the use was coming from. In addition, we have just recently started a pandemic collection for our teachers in service here in our education school. And that has been an interesting process as well. Not only are we seeing vast interest from the teachers, but from our users as well, as they struggle with social and emotional learning and growth during this period. Who knew that children's books could help us all get through this situation?
Children's books help us all with the issues you just discussed, but we're just now as a society starting to see the real impact. I know it's been, Robin, maybe not as much in the UK, but here in the US, some really staggering data on just what the impact of not being in school has had on a huge cohort of students. And the news is, you know, we might have anticipated, but it's just not good. So that's so interesting, Beth, that you're trying to build up collections, not only to support people on the psychosocial side, but also in the education school. How can the education system sort of respond to the fallout from COVID? That's fascinating. So Gwen, what about you? You're relatively newcomer to Elsevier.
I am. I joined on February 28th, 2020, which was a very exciting time to join any new company. But my academic career started, I intended to be a cultural anthropologist, and actually went and did 2 years of fieldwork in Indonesia. People get a certain image in their head, but I was studying the Roman Catholic Church, which the largest Roman Catholic seminary in the world is on the island of Flores. So my interest in large global entities goes back a couple of decades, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't use that training of why is this happening, or what are the structural things that are leading in this direction, and you know what are the interactions there. And then I became a librarian. I started in access services. I was the head of circulation, and you know, that is a lot of mediation of access, and particularly print access, as a shared limited resource. And then I became the executive director of OhioLink, which is a state agency and library consortium for the state of Ohio. And that is where really the aggregate data for decision making starts. Really, you really need to collate that data and get that data in order to help decision making at the collective level. And I would say that, and I really enjoyed my time there, but I'm a curious person. And Elsevier, I met Kumsal at Charleston during that. And it just seemed like a really interesting challenge, and interesting, you know, if you're going to learn about the other side of the business of publishing, Elsevier is a pretty good place to learn that. So, and again, we're very data driven, both as in terms of the IND foci with our pro bono data driven reports, but also in our products. And it's just sort of a data at global scale is a integral part of the company.
Well, and you know, hopefully Elsevier, because as you say, at scale, you know, you can see you've got a big window into that data that at a smaller size, it's just not as valid a sample. So you can anticipate a lot of those shifts just because you've got N is big statistically for you all. So I would characterize your panel upcoming at Charleston, and thank you all for that. I love this panel and your makeup and your perspectives on these issues. I think it's going to be a really great session, but I would characterize it as pragmatic. You know, and you can talk about whether you agree or disagree with that, but it looks like you're going to try to provide some takeaways for folks that are actionable in the near term. Do you agree with that characterization? And could you please share what you're currently working on and what your biggest priorities are in this area for the next 12 to 18 months? But yeah, is this intended to be pragmatic? Are there some takeaways you'd like folks to come away with? And do those line up with what your priorities are over the next, year and a half?
I would encourage the attendees would be to really think about if the solutions that they are seeking in their own DEI work are things that can be evidenced by data, and if that data can be meaningful for them, where people might be interested in the project that is being run at Imperial. I am still working on that, so all of the information, and in particular like the scripts that run some of these projects, are all available for people to go away and have a look at afterwards if they're interested to do so. And my goals for this project are more broadly for the next 12 months. So I'm working with helping some other institutions in the UK investigate and potentially, some of them started adapting to potentially adopt some of the structure that we've built in this project, and trying to still really define how whether this project's outcomes how they actually contribute towards our broader institutional DEI goals, and communicating that's as much, in fact, even more work, more difficult to communicate than the building of the technical structure that we've built.
Right. And so often it's more the cultural change that can be sort of the long pole, to quote a project management term. It's the thing that longitudinally runs and takes the longest. So that's a really good point, but recognizing that challenge. So thanks for that. Beth or Gwen?
Well, I would say absolutely pragmatic. A part of what we are hoping to do is find other folks who might be interested in doing similar work and seeing what we can see longitudinally and across institutions in terms of looking at the future. Cracking the e-resources nut to drill down even further into what we see, who's publishing, Own Voices publishing, who's using this information. How can we support small publishers who are struggling to get their voices out? These are all things that we're interested in working with our colleagues around the state and the world. So, yeah. Oh, and I should also say, we have a huge collection here, like most research libraries, and trying to do some sort of analysis like this on the entire collection is, well, it's frightening, to tell you the truth. So what we tend to do is break things down into intersections, and we continue to try and identify those intersections, see how we can evaluate those collections, look for experts who can help us explore them, talk to our students and our researchers, and move those projects forward.
And again, I guess, you also there's the common theme, talking about the cultural change and the communication that's required to make people stop and think and consider what might be a better path forward. So
That's exactly right.
So Gwen?
And I would say that the focus is for us right now is, again, benchmarking using data for actionable insights. And we've done a lot of work in gender equity, and we're part of the multi-publisher compact that is being led by the Royal Society of Chemistry to gather not just gender, but race and ethnicity data to sort of benchmark against the entire scholarly communication system. So first we need to benchmark, like we have to know where we are, and then we have to decide how, what are the interventions that can be done to ensure full participation across the scholarly ecosystem. And I would say that, so for me, one of the interesting things has been watching the process of, we started here, we realized part of the way through this was insufficient, we backed up, and the process of deciding in an imperfect world that we're going to try and do the best we can, see where we are, and then iterate. It is a process of iteration. So I would say that is the pragmatic goal for us as a company. For me, it's creating awareness of these issues, either with the reports or things like this presentation at Charleston, and also the sort of, so not just a model, here's a model that might be useful for people to use, but we also have a platform called ICSR Labs where people can propose a project. You have to bring your own developers and programmers, but you can combine your data with Elsevier data. And is that a way for people to use this vast data at a certain level with their own data sets to, again, drive some actionable insights and awareness forward?
Well, and again, as we mentioned earlier, the value there is that, the scale, the sheer scale of the sheer amount of publishing activity going on at Elsevier, not only publishing activity, but I'm assuming user activity as well, of course, in a anonymized and ethical manner.
And the other thing I want to mention about why equity in research matters, it's not just about participation, but as both Beth and Robin has talked about, we all sort of know this, but I want to make this point, is when you're talking about the published research or output or what information is available, that has very real outcomes in clinical systems, for example, or policy decisions. And if you don't have diverse and inclusive representation in the research, that is one of my, I don't know whether to call it a least favorite example or a favorite example, is Elsevier did a report on Alzheimer's research because that tends to have a bigger impact on women. And when you look at the research, most of it is not only performed in clinical trials on men, it's performed on male mice, which has very real implications for drug development and efficiency. So it's not just we want an inclusive participatory research workforce, but downstream, not having that has incredible effects on everyone.
Yep. And that's a great point, and that's a great way to wrap up. And I'm recalling back to, even this was within the last 25 years, the data that came through on heart disease and gender inequities in heart disease research. And, again, just women as underrepresented in that area, that cohort. And it takes a while for that light bulb to go off, but I'm going to close with, and you each echoed this in your comments, a lot of the work you're doing is really raising awareness of, hey, we know that there's work to be done here. Now we're going to put systems and efforts in place because now we know better. We're going to try to do better. And I think, as pulling together questions for this panel, Dr. Angela was a professor of mine at undergraduate school, so she's top of mind for me always. But that quote really jumped to the top. So thank you so much for taking time to join us today. This is fascinating and so much really important work to be done in this area. So thank the three of you for all of your efforts and your leadership. And we will see you all next week in Charleston.
Looking forward to it.
I know Beth, Rob, and Gwen, take care, travel safe, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.